Hey there, my name is Mark Horoszowski. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO of MovingWorlds. I'm going to use this video to dive into what is environmental, social, and governance reporting, why our companies do it, and right now, why are we hearing about this like everywhere? But I think it's worth looking at why is this a thing in the first place? Why do companies care? Why do investors care? Why do consumers care? Why do you care? And I think there's a great quote from Alan Jope, the chief executive officer of Unilever, who says that even as a business leader, we have a responsibility to tackle the climate crisis as a business and through the direct action by our brands. And even during a tough economic time, during wartime, during political upheaval, during health crises, we are still seeing businesses say it is part of our responsibility, and we are actively putting resources to manage things like the environmental crisis and social equity issues. Environmental social governance, or ESG reporting, is what helps companies figure out what to do, how are they doing, and how to do it better. But I think it's worth labeling that in this area, there's oftentimes a lot of confusion. We'll hear words like corporate social impact or corporate social responsibility or ESG or sustainability or DEI or social equity. We hear all these things, but they tend to fall under two main buckets. One is corporate social responsibility, which is self-imposed and self-regulated efforts to make a company more responsible. That quote from the Unilever CEO, that is a self-imposed requirement and a strategy to make its company more responsible. Now, it is being driven by outside pressure from employees, from consumers, from regulators and others, but it's still a internally imposed requirement and strategy. On the other hand, ESG is typically led by investors and governments who are requiring reporting. They're telling a company, hey, you have to do this thing. And this can be eliminating child labor and child slavery from supply chains, or it can be carbon reporting. And this varies by government and by region. But oftentimes we see both of these being used interchangeably, and that's one of the reasons why there's actually a lot of confusion in this space. But we're really going to dive into ESG, which stands for environmental. So this is the environmental impact of a company, climate change, biodiversity, use of water, carbon emissions, etc. Social factors include things like equal opportunity, social equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion, human rights in a company and in the community as well. So more of the kind of human and social factors. And then there's governance. So this is related to, does the company have governance things in place for its board, for its executives? Who makes up its executive team? Who makes up its board team? What voting rights do shareholders have? Do employees have voting rights? So combined together, ESG can be a force to make companies more responsible and really responsive to employee, consumer, and community demands. So we've talked about ESG, we've talked about CSR. The other thing that I want to share from a definition perspective before we go any farther is something that we'll hear pretty frequently when we talk about ESG, which are scope 1 emissions, scope 2 emissions, and scope 3 emissions. A company can say, hey, we're carbon neutral, but that might only apply to their scope 1 emissions. So you really have to kind of look into these statements. Now, scope 1 is what is actually being emitted through the core operations of a business. If Tesla is manufacturing cars, then scope 1 emissions are the amount of carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions that they are omitting during the process of manufacturing their cars. Scope 2 is related to the energy being required to do that. So carbon is being emitted by a power plant or other. Scope 2 says these are the emissions that are being emitted indirectly, but still because of us. And then scope 3 emissions are other upstream and downstream activities. So the distribution of a product or the carbon in order to get raw materials into the manufacturing plant. So the most progressive companies will actually measure and report on scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, but oftentimes many are just going to highlight scope 1 emissions and use that to maybe tell a richer story than what's really going on. Now, ESG reporting is growing rapidly, and I think almost alarmingly so, right? It's there's this big spike over the last 10 years, really condensed in the last 4, where we're just seeing this rapid growth in terms of ESG growing, both in terms of the number of billions of dollars under assets, but also in the number of companies that are actually doing reporting. 250 of the world's biggest companies are actively engaged in ESG reporting. And we are continuing to see this continuing to grow. So there is a lot. This movement is being spearheaded. And with that rapid growth, there's been greenwashing. There's been a lot of innovations. There's been a lot of people pretending to kind of make an impact here. And so as we're going to kind of go through in the rest of the video here, we're going to talk a little bit more about how that all works. But I do think it's worth exploring what is driving this trend in ESG reporting. Now, corporate social responsibility investments and ESG investments often go hand in hand because once you start to measure things, you start to see areas where you can improve. However, they're not always mutually aligned. So focusing on ESG, there are some great bodies of research that show that investing in ESG beyond reporting requirements actually pays off for the business. MovingWorlds actually did some research in 2021. Amongst many things that we found here, we did quote Paul Pullman, the former CEO of Unilever, who said that achieving the Sustainable Development Goals is the biggest business opportunity that we've ever seen in the history of mankind. The cost of inaction is actually higher than the cost of action. The cost that businesses are incurring from any single Sustainable Development Goal not being achieved is actually more expensive than the cost of achieving all of the goals. What he's essentially saying here is because of disruption in supply chains that are happening because of war or because of climate or because of political disruption or because of refugee or I should say political or social issues that are relating to people needing to be refugees, the cost of that to business, the global economy, is actually more than if we invested in avoiding those issues in the first place. And this is why we're seeing a big growth and investment in the social enterprise movement, right? And that's really where MovingWorlds spends a lot of time, is saying, how can social enterprises grow and actually partner with corporations to help them achieve their ESG targets? And when companies do invest, not just measuring, but actually achieving their targets, they realize at least 5 benefits. Starting at the top, more employees want to work at companies who have values that align with their own. The majority of people are actually willing to take a pay cut in order to work at a company that aligns with their own values. So by having a sound ESG strategy in place and executing on it, you will inspire, attract, and retain your top talent. The second one is taking regulatory relationships from reactive to proactive. What I mean by that is, if you're a company, let's say a Ford motor company, and you are manufacturing cars, if you are more active in ESG reporting and setting targets to show how you're going to be weaning off of natural sources of propulsion like gas, heavy carbon emitting gas, if you are imposing your own standards and telling regulators how you're going to move away from that in the future, then you will actually delay regulation, and governments will actually partner with you to help move towards a more sustainable propulsion system. The next factor is building resilient and sustainable supply chains. So companies, I've quoted Unilever now a couple times, they're making a big investment in achieving ESG targets and partnering with social enterprises, because that's going to create a more diversified supply chain. We saw supply chains fall apart with political instability, with war, with climate crisis, with health crisis. And so by companies taking an active role here, they can diversify their suppliers and they can ensure that they're sourcing from areas that can better withstand, political catastrophe or environmental catastrophe. The next one is enhancing brand value with key stakeholders. So if you're a example, consumer packaged good, and you're trying to find shelf space on an Amazon, on a grocery store, by having certain ESG commitments in place, you're more likely to be received better by some of those partners. Now, these partners can also be supply chain partners or promotion partners or marketing partners, but having an alignment around ESG will actually have you be seen as a more strategic partner. And then the last one here, maybe you could argue this is the first one, is it creates new market opportunities. Uh, every company right now is thinking about what is the future of our business if we do live in a place with consumers that are more environmentally and socially conscious. We need to develop products and services that are actually regenerative, are circular, are environmentally and socially equitable. And doing so will help you tap into new consumer bases. So to quote Peter Drucker, what gets measured gets managed. And that's why a lot of the movement around ESG is focused on measurement, because if we can't measure it, then we can't improve it. And so if we actually look at the history of ESG reporting, we'll see that it largely comes from this desire to make improvements. The ESG movement, first and foremost, was started not by investors, not by regulators, but actually by activists, by people who said, our companies have a massive force on the global economy, on governments, on politicians, on consumers, on employees, and we are going to make efforts to use that force to create a bigger impact. But in the 1970s, right as this movement was starting, Thomas Friedman published The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Profits. This one went into education everywhere. MBAs, business leaders, everybody was trained on this idea. You just need to increase profits. And that really started to delay the movement. But in the late 80s, we actually saw that Calvert Investments sponsored the US Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, banning new investments in South Africa. So here we actually saw ESG investors seeing how companies were being activists in things like the Vietnam War, apartheid and racism in South Africa, and they started to rise up. And so this Calvert Investments actually said, hey, let's help create an act, let's ban investments. And this, we started to see a new rise of social activism being led by investors. And we saw this continuing to grow. We then saw in 1988, James S. Coleman wrote an article that really introduced the concept that companies, if they built social capital, could actually have a return on that investment, and that it made business sense to engage in social good. In the year 2000, Kofi Annan launched the Global Compact Initiative, a United Nations initiative that helped companies think about what they could do to be more responsible from a social and environmental aspect and how to go about that. And then we also saw the launch of the Global Reporting Initiative, which we'll touch on in just a little bit. In 2006, the United Nations, seeing the growth in impact investing and ESG investing, came out with principles, the PRI, to further develop and improve the way that impact investing was being discussed. In 2014, India enacted the first ever corporate social responsibility law. And then in 2015, we saw the launch of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And then we've since seen investors around the world trying to align their impact measurement, and corporations align their ESG measurement with these Sustainable Development Goals. And since then, we've seen some regulation from EU requiring more reporting. The United States, at the time of this recording, just closed a comment period by its Securities and Exchange Commission to really look at and show, okay, what are companies going to need to report on? So we're seeing governments, we're seeing investors, we're seeing employees, we're seeing consumers. Everybody's kind of demanding more from an ESG perspective. And this then begs the question of, okay, well, who owns this movement? And right now, it's largely being claimed by investors. Recently, I've really been using the phrase that investors are actually kind of hijacking this movement. They're saying, we want to know, are our companies conducting ESG related strategies and activities? And the question here is like, okay, why do investors care? Now, part of the reason they care is because the people giving them money to invest are saying, hey, we care about this stuff. But we also need to follow the money here, right? Investors are here to make money. And what they're really interested in, what's really driving their investments in ESG movement is disclosure. They want to know how much carbon is being emitted by a company so that in case there is a carbon tax, they know how it might affect their investments. They want to know the health of the supply chain because if climate crises hit and affect their supply chain, they want to know how it's going to affect their profits. They want to know what they're doing for social equity, diversity, equity, inclusion, eliminating child labor from supply chains and distribution chains, because they want to know if they're at risk of lawsuits. So the investor-led ESG movement sounds good. And we're like, oh, that's great. Investors are demanding this. But if you actually look into deeper what investors are reporting on, they really just want disclosure so they can manage their own risks. But on the other side of this, we have consumers. Consumers care more and more and more about the ingredients in their products, if the brand aligns with their own values, and if they want to associate it. So consumers are actually having a big force to get companies to care about ESG. Now, regulators, so think government, both governments, single governments, United States, trade agencies, trade associations, or something like the EU, they are regulating this because of the demands that they're seeing from society, right? We're seeing a lot of people rise up and saying, hey, we need to better manage the way our corporations are being managed, and regulators are responding to that. And then, of course, corporations, right? Any corporate leader right now that is on a global stage is talking about disruption to supply chain, is talking about how hard it is to find the best employees. And so corporations are also talking about how their consumers care about this more and more, even their B2B consumers, as well as their supply chain partners. So corporations want to improve their operations and their products to respond to employees, to consumers, and to partners. And then we also see nonprofits that kind of work at the interplay here, right? Where nonprofits are being a collective voice of consumers and filling in gaps of regulators. But we're also seeing associations that are being created by investors and corporations to help influence policy, sometimes positively, but sometimes also trying to put the brakes on the ESG movement. So ESG reporting itself is the practice of companies disclosing the most significant economic, environmental, and social impacts that arise from their corporate activities, and thereby being held accountable for these impacts and responsible for managing them. Here I have a screenshot of Unilever's Sustainable Living Plan. It's a summary of 10 years of progress, and it also indicates their goals and how they are progressing towards their goals. But what I want to explore now is, okay, let's say you're a company, let's say you do ESG reporting. How do you even start? What are the different tools being used? And if you're a consumer or an employee or an investor and you're looking at this saying, which of these metrics can I trust and how do I know if I can trust them? So let's start looking at just ESG frameworks. These are words that if you are following the movement, you might be hearing now. Science-based targets, GRI, SASB, CDP, Dow Jones Sustainability Index, UN Global Compact, EcoVadis. Like, these are all frameworks, but let's take a closer look at what are these frameworks. So there's a few organizations, ISO, UN Global Compact, GRI, SASB, Science-Based Targets, and Integrated Reporting that provide guidance. They tell companies, hey, we think you should measure your carbon output, and here is how you should measure it. The next groups are aggregation and auditors. So these are oftentimes also hubs that companies will even subscribe as like a software as a service, like EcoVadis or Hague Index or CSR Hub, that will actually take these different ESG data points and aggregate them into one place. And then some of these groups will also serve as auditors for that. Then you have regulation, groups like the European Commission or the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. And then you have other groups that do evaluation, Dow Jones Sustainability Index and CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. They don't just say, hey, this is what you should measure. What they're saying is, hey, based on all the stuff that you have measured and aggregated, we are now going to rank you against other companies and kind of give you an award. Are you good or not? SAP, as an example, is the #1 company on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, which aggregates a whole bunch of data that is provided by following these guidance providers. And then there's other organizations like MSCI and Sustainalytics who are very, really work for investors, and they help provide comparisons and benchmarks for different companies. So on one side, you really have an impact perspective. In the middle, you have regulation. And then on the far side, we have tools being used for impact decisions. So let's talk a little bit more about like how these work together. So a lot of text on the slide here. Sorry about that, but let's walk through it. Starting with ISO 26000, the primary purpose here is ISO says you should develop a corporate social responsibility function. It doesn't tell you how, it doesn't tell you how to measure things, what to measure. It just says that if you're compliant, you have a corporate social responsibility or sustainability management function in your organization. The next one is the GRI. The GRI helps companies understand what factors they should measure and manage and how to do so. It's often used alongside SASB, CDP, and the UN Global Compact. The Sustainability Accounting Standards Board really creates a roadmap that says, if you are in a specific industry and of a certain size and in certain locations, these are the things that you have to measure. And these are the types of metrics that we will accept, right, that are universally acceptable for reporting on things. Like if you're emitting your carbon emissions, like what do you emit? The number of particles, the tons of carbon, the amount of time you spend emitting carbon, a comparison. Do you do scope 1, scope 2, scope 3? Do you do all? SASB really helps provide guidance on what to do, and then GRI is a layer on top of how to do it. And we do have a complete guide on our website that really goes through this even more. It even shows sample reports, or if you really want to nerd out, you can also apply to join the MovingWorlds Transform Support Hub, where you can actually access even more education and learning on how to measure this. The next framework that's very popular is CDP. So this really says how helps companies understand how effective they are at managing water and greenhouse gas emissions. So it gives them some very specific guidance on what and how to measure, what numbers to report, how to report, and then based on the company, is that good or is that not? The UN Global Compact is think of it almost more of like an inspiring network. You want to be a part of this club, but in order to be a part of that club, you have to commit to certain targets. So not just measuring and reporting on things, but actually committing to achieving and contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I've also included the B impact assessment. So for companies that are not publicly traded, that don't have high investor pressure, the B impact assessment really exists for them. It helps you look at how you're governed, your employees, your community, your environment, and your customers and your core product. These 5 different factors asks you a lot of questions, gives you a lot of guidance on how to improve your operations to really make sure that you're being environmentally responsible and socially equitable. So zooming in a little bit more here, like on the Unilever plan, as you look at some of these metrics, you might see something here in the middle, like 49% reduction in water. Now, the way that Unilever came up with that is using SASB guidance. They saw that based on their types of products, they should be measuring their water consumption. GRI then gave them guidance in terms of what to measure that relates to water consumption and how to measure it. And then they further use CDP for some very specific metrics as well as some comparison. So you really do see these frameworks kind of stitched together. And that's true for many of the numbers that you're seeing here. Right. Now, there are a lot of nuances here. Sometimes you don't use GRI. Sometimes you don't use CDP. Sometimes you might pick a metric that does not come from SASB. But for the most part, what you're seeing is some interplay of those together. So here was that zoom in on that water function, but I've already provided that example. So to get started with ESG within a company, what we tend to see is that first and foremost, there's clear ownership and support for it. There is a C-level, so like a chief something officer that is being responsible for it. The board itself is actually their performance is being managed and measured based on if they're achieving certain ESG targets. So are the chief executives of the company. And then investors are usually a big influencer here. So after that, then an ESG team needs to be built. It is challenging to set targets, to measure those targets, and then to influence the business to really adopt those. So you do see an ESG team being developed. From there, you'll decide on what to measure. As provided and explained on earlier, you're probably going to start with the SASB materiality matrix. Then you'll go on and look for more specific guidance from GRI or CDP or one of the other functions. This is also a great place where you might join the UN Global Compact, get training from them, and get guidance in terms of what targets to set. From there, you'll establish a framework and decide on the different ESG factors that should be reported on. And then you'll establish a baseline and target. So once you have a baseline using your different frameworks, you'll then try and move forward and set your own targets. The UN Global Compact will help you set targets. We're also seeing increased adoption from the Science-Based Targets Initiative that is actually saying, hey, based on science, for you to really contribute to limiting global warming or social equity, like these are the actual targets that you should be setting. From there, you'll further align the executive and the board so that their compensation is being associated with ESG targets. And the time of this reporting, we're also seeing other companies say, it's not just executive and board, we're also going to start, even like directors or managers or even employees are going to start being measured on achievement of these factors. So then the next one is to integrate reporting and achievement across the business. So that means the ESG team from step number 2 is not just this kind of isolated group, but they're actually being seen as a strategic partner to every core aspect of the business, to product, to operations, to human resources, to sales and marketing, etc. Step 8 is to build systems to automate data, capture that reporting. It is hard and it's time intensive and it's costly to capture data. We saw a recent report that said, it costs well over $600,000 for a publicly traded company to really start developing their first ESG report. And so you will be building systems in order to automate that. And then you should get audited, both to validate your numbers and also to improve your own processes. And then lastly here, you want to communicate progress. And we're seeing more companies move to real-time reports, which I think is really exciting. You're able to get real-time data showing how responsible is a company and does it have targets and how is it tracking towards those targets. So in terms of what you should measure, right, what we kind of see is that there's things that your business is best in the world at, right? And so you want to map your assets, your resources, and then you can brainstorm how all of these tools can help provide progress to the Sustainable Development Goals. From there, you want to look at what is the future of your business. Your company might be best at one thing right now in the world, but as it grows, it's trying to either evolve or pivot or further partner with others. So where is the business going? What is its strategy? What problems does it have? What does it need to learn? And how can ESG help support that? And then, of course, investors, stakeholders, and customers are going to want things. So based on the pressure that's being applied by them, and here are the different frameworks previously mentioned, provide guidance on that. And then there's the real, tying back to Alan Jope's quote from Unilever, there's the things that are actually like, okay, what can our company actually do to make the world a better place? What are the sustainable development goals that need the most attention and how can we support on those? So kind of the intersection of this place is really where you should be setting your targets on. You might have to report on other things for regulatory purposes, but in terms of setting more ambitious targets, this is really where you want your targets to live. But I think it's worth noting that this movement is already encountering a lot of failure. Earlier I actually mentioned that ESG is being hijacked by investors. If you care about this space, you should definitely follow Tim Mohin on LinkedIn and subscribe to his weekly newsletter. But he recently posted an article from the Wall Street Journal that compared ESG rankings, and it collected over 13,000 ESG scores. And it looked at the number of companies that were getting comparable ratings, disagreeing scores, or even opposite ratings. So some organizations were like, hey, this company is really good in ESG. Others were saying, hey, this is really bad. And what you can actually see is only 1/3 of companies by other frameworks and other measurement organizations had the same agreeing score. That means the majority of companies, some people are saying this is bad, or some people are saying, it's good, right? And so there's a lot of confusion here because how can one rating system say a company like Apple is good? How can another one say it's bad? because of that, people aren't trusting these ratings as much. Other companies like Apple, they've been measuring and reporting on this stuff, but it took them 3 years to cut ties with a supplier that they knew was using child labor, right? So again, we're saying, hey, we've been reporting on this. We know this time and attention. You knew about it and you still weren't taking action. So again, this kind of starts to hurt the ESG movement. And then you're seeing articles of people saying the world might be better off without this ESG measurement. Now, this article kind of comes around to further explain this point in a way that's saying things are needed. Companies should be taking action, but it should not be led by investors. And that's really what we're seeing today. And in fact, a very prominent individual, Stuart Kirk, who's now actually been either put on leave or fired, I'm not 100% sure, from HSBC, just spoke at a conference that told people that that investors and companies shouldn't worry about climate risk and they shouldn't have to measure it. And there's a lot of people that disagree with this, but actually it is worth listening to his point because he's a prominent person. A lot of other people actually share his opinion. And even if you don't agree with it, it's worth understanding this other side. Now, the other thing that we're seeing is greenwashing. So on one side, we're seeing Larry Fink, make these bold, audacious statements, right? Contribute to society or risk losing our support. BlackRock, of course, is the world's biggest kind of impact investing firm. They have trillions and trillions of dollars. I want to say 17, it might even be more, trillions of dollars of assets under management. And they're saying, if you as a company want to do business with us, you need to contribute to society. Now, as soon as a recession hit or as soon as things get hard, BlackRock is actually telling that it's going to vote against any climate resolutions that corporations and their shareholders are going to make. So, kind of on one side, they're kind of trying to rebuild while they're still kind of breaking down the system, on the other side. And this real kind of greenwashing movement that is really hurting ESG. And again, it's really hijacking the intent of the ESG movement. It's moving it away from consumers and employees. It's really centralizing around what investors want. And then investors like Larry Fink are actually living in opposition to the words that they're communicating. And then you have prominent CEOs like the CEO of Tesla, Elon Musk, who was recently kicked off of the S&P's top ESG list, even though Exxon was on there, right? And there's a quote here that some, like Musk, believe that ratings should reward companies that do the most for the planet and society. Others, including firms like the S&P that produce the scores, say they're meant to show how much risk a company's stock faces from ESG factors. So again, you can see investors are talking about doing ESG for climate disclosure risks. But there's another voice that's really important to hear as well, which Amy Dominy, who's the amazing founder of Dominy Investments, kind of had a response to Elon Musk that says, the reason that you're confused is because you're a single issue CEO, and that's not the way of the future. The way of the future is people and planet, and a fractured society can't make anything, including electric cars. So part of the reason Tesla was removed from the list is because they had other issues, supply chain violations, employee equity issues, diversity lawsuits, terrible management structures, very kind of toxic workplace. So all of these things were kind of contributing to them. So, yes, they make electric cars, but that doesn't actually mean that there's going to be a net reduction in energy being used to move cars. And there's a lot of environmental degradation that happens trying to get batteries into cars. So is it actually better? And being a single issue CEO or product isn't enough. But I do want to turn to this quote from Muhammad Yunus, who says that right now, unprecedented technological capabilities combined with unlimited human creativity have given us tremendous power to take on intractable problems like poverty, unemployment, disease, and environmental degradation. Our challenge is to translate this extraordinary potential into meaningful change. And here is where I say there is still hope for the ESG movement. There are people like Yunus Social Business, selfishly and self-serving MovingWorlds, some of our partners like SAP and Unilever, and the World Economic Forum's Alliance for Social Global Alliance for Social Entrepreneurship. These are organizations that are combining and saying there is actually a way of doing business better, not just from a reporting standpoint, but actually building a business that has environmental sustainability and governance embedded into its core business. And this entity is called the social enterprise. And increasingly, we're seeing corporations actually move ahead beyond just investor-forced reporting into setting meaningful ESG targets and they're partnering with social enterprises in order to do that. And so, I want to thank you for tuning in to this video about ESG reporting. I'm going to give just a quick plug here about what MovingWorlds works and why it's playing into this space. First and foremost, we help professionals grow in their careers by learning about things like ESG, social entrepreneurship, design thinking, human-centered design, and more, and build partnerships with social enterprises. And that's how we live into our mission, which is to really enable social enterprises to grow capacity and overcome any challenge. One of the things we're also really well known for is our global experteering network, where professionals can not only learn and build community, but they can actually experteer, they can volunteer their skills directly with our network of social enterprises around the world. And then we also partner with corporations like Microsoft, Unilever, SAP, PayPal, and more, who are looking to achieve their ESG targets and CSR targets by educating and engaging their employees, by providing their professionals learning opportunities, and then giving them time and space and resources to volunteer their skills with social enterprises. And then lastly, we also network heavily with other social enterprise support organizations, impact investors, accelerators, and others who are looking to further support their network of social enterprises. So I want to thank you for tuning in. I hope you found this useful. Definitely let me know in the comments if you have more questions. Don't be shy with those. But if you really want to nerd out on this, definitely recommend you join the MovingWorlds, either the Institute or get involved in our Transform Support Hub to learn more and see how you can use your career and your role to help build a better world, a more sustainable economy that cares about the planet and prioritizes humans above profits. Thank you so much, and really hope you enjoyed today's presentation.